Hello! In this video I want to share top 5 craziest tactics that were used to change the outcome of the wars. Okay, so let us start with World War I. If you had to guess what weapon changed the outcome of World War I on the Western Front, was it the tanks? Well, most historians agree that it wasn't the tanks, because tanks were used only in a very late stage of World War I. Was it the poisonous gas, maybe? Well, no, since both sides actually had the ability to use poisonous gas. Was it the flamethrower? Well, no. It was the trench shotgun, Winchester Model 97, utilized by the Americans. So, how the hell did a shotgun change the outcome of the war? Well, the American general, John Pershing, actually realized that shotguns are ideal weapons for trench warfare, especially against the Germans, since the Germans attacked in large groups and very dense large groups of German soldiers would attack the enemy trenches, and that's why the Winchester Model 97 shotgun was ideal for dealing with the Germans. The shotgun was first used against the Filipino uprising in 1897. So after the Americans took the Philippines from Spain, the people of that island decided to launch a revolution against the Americans, because they were just in a process of fighting a revolution against the Spanish, and when the Americans conquered the island, they just continued their revolution against the Americans. But the US Army used the shotgun in order to destroy the Moors and crush the uprising, and General John Pershing realized that this is the weapon needed on the Western Front. And there were a few modifications that were made in order to make the weapon even more deadly. So in the First World War, you could actually just pull the trigger and work on the slide, and in that way you could produce 6 blasts in a span of just a few seconds. And that is why the weapon was known as trench broom or as trench sweeper. And you could even miss your target by by 1 meter and still kill your target. And the weapon was for the first time utilized in the Battle of the Belleau Wood very successfully. After the Germans broke through the French lines, the Americans decided not to run. Instead, they dug out foxholes in the ground and used their new weapon in order to destroy the German advance. And the shotguns were also very useful, because they were used in order to kill enemy pigeons, and even hand grenades mid-air could be stopped by the American shotguns. And here you can see the Battle of the Belleau Wood, and that famous battle was actually the last big attempt of the German military to turn the tide of war in the spring of 1918. And precisely this battle is the battle that crushed the last German offensive and allowed the Allies the opportunity to launch a counter-offensive of their own. And the German military even complained to the Americans, and they sent them a formal note in which they asked the Americans not to use shotguns in World War I, because, quote-unquote, shotguns were immoral. But I simply have to agree with the American military that responded by saying, well, first of all, who are you to complain when you use poisonous gas? And second of all, just because weapon is deadly, that doesn't make it immoral. And so the Americans continued to use the weapon, and they won the war. Okay, but let us jump to an example number 2. Do you remember maybe that time when Hitler used metamfetamine in order to conquer France? Well, okay, here we go. So, what am I talking about? Well, in 1937, a German chemist, Fritz Hauschild, synthesized pervitin, and pervitin is actually a form of methamphetamine that was used in order to give energy to soldiers and to allow them not to sleep, to cause fearlessness, and Pervitin was even perfectly legal in Germany until 1941, and at the same time the Nazis were killing all the drug addicts because they saw them as one of those groups that needed to die. But methamphetamine wasn't seen as a harmful drug, which is why it was perfectly legal. But in 1941 the Germans realized that methamphetamine is actually not that harmless as it seems. It was also used in the Polish campaign, Pervitin it was, and it gave pretty good results during the Polish campaign. But what happened in France? Well, it also gave Germans great success, but I'll talk about some downsides of using methamphetamine on a large scale. The German military was given the instruction to use 1 pill per day and 2 per night. I'm talking about Pervitin. But to be perfectly honest, there are many reasons for why the German attack on France was so successful. And it wasn't just that crazy Germans were on meth and that's how they won. Well, first of all, General Mainstein, had this brilliant idea of attacking throughout the Ardennes. And at the time, people actually thought that the tanks were unable to penetrate the Ardennes forests, but it turns out they were, which is why the French were completely taken by surprise. Then also, what needs to be said is that the German tanks had just the right ratio of maneuverability and speed, and that is why they were able to move very quickly. And often the speed of the German tanks would simply shock the French, and on multiple occasions the French troops actually mistook German tanks for British tanks because they thought, no way, these guys are moving so quickly. But additional reason for their quickness was the fact that they were using methamphetamine, and when you're on meth you can just drive a tank for 48 hours without sleep, and that also was one of the important reasons for the quickness of the German military. And precisely through their speed the Germans were able to blitzkrieg the French and surround them, and in the end win the war very quickly. But now I want to tell you something about the downsides of meth, which is why methamphetamine wasn't used on the large scale in the East, on the Eastern Front, because by 1941 Hitler was aware of the downsides. Some German soldiers experienced fearlessness and euphoria, which is kind of good for waging a war, but they also experienced delirium, hallucinations, and heart failure. Some German soldiers just died from heart failure, and others saw monsters in the French woods, which is why they emptied their magazines into the trees, which also wasn't useful. And many of them just started to act irrationally and do push-ups for no reason and stuff like that, which is why the German military decided to not use such large doses of methamphetamine in their conquest of the Soviet Union. But one of the most bizarre stories that I heard about usage of meth in war simply has to be a story of a Finnish soldier that used it during the continuation war with the Soviets. So Oimo Koivun, this soldier, and I will put a link in the description, there is a great video that tells his entire story, was a Finnish soldier that was pursued by the Soviets, and in order to escape he ate entire box of these Pervitin pills, which made him enter a trip that lasted for 5 days. And his story is truly fascinating. He mistook the Soviets for Finnish soldiers and managed to ski through the Soviet positions. He somehow escaped, and then later he remembered his speaking to his friend, and his friend obviously wasn't even there. Then he just gave his rifle to a tree because he mistook a rifle for his friend. He ate raw birds, and allegedly he saw dancing bears, and in the end he stepped on a landmine. And his trip therefore had a very bad ending, but I will put the video in the description if you want to hear his entire story. But yeah, Nazis actually did manage to use meth, at least in France. They utilized it in a very effective way and they won the war. Okay, now let me tell you something about a very relevant conflict. The 6-Day War is a war that changed the geopolitics of the Middle East for decades, and consequences of this war are even felt today. So how did the Israeli state manage to turn the tide of war in their favor in 1967? So what happened essentially in 1967? Israel and Syria were engaged in border skirmishes, and Egypt, at least if you ask the Egyptians and Nasser, claimed that they just wanted to send a message to Israel not to go to war with Syria, which is why Egypt began to mobilize their forces. But Jews saw this as a threat, and they realized that they had to do a preemptive strike if they want to win the war. Because if you just looked at the data, the Israeli forces were in a very tricky position. While they had 100,000 men, the Arab coalition consisted of Egypt, Syria and Jordan, had 240,000 troops. Israel had 800 tanks, while the Arab coalition had 2,500 tanks. Israel had 300 planes, while the coalition had 1,000 planes. And so the Israelis decided to launch Operation Focus. And what's interesting is how brilliantly this operation was actually executed. And the Israeli forces were in quite a tricky position because Egypt had just gotten new Soviet aircrafts from Brezhnev, and the Jews, they didn't have technological advantage in this war as they had in the previous war. The Egyptians actually for the first time had some of the best aircrafts in the world because the Soviets sent them. And that is how the Israelis concluded they had to destroy the Egyptian Air Force in a preemptive strike, and they actually managed to destroy 80% of the Egyptian Air Force in one day, which is why the war lasted for 6 days. So 5th of June 1967, Israel launched Operation Focus. And by the way, Israel lost only 19 planes, while Egypt lost more than 250. So, but what was the brilliance of the operation? So, first of all the Israeli pilots got orders to fly below radars, and instead of attacking from the east, which is the fastest route, they went to fly above the sea and then attacked from the north, which is something that Egyptians weren't expecting. But the brilliance of the operation was, and as far as I know, this was actually a coincidence. So at 7:35 in the morning, the Egyptian morning patrol was over, and in the moment of the Jewish attack, the Egyptians only had 3 aircrafts in flight by pure accident, because at 7:35 the morning patrol came down and Egyptians had no planes in the air. And at 7:40 all the Egyptian pilots had breakfast. And Israel attacked precisely at 7:45 in the morning. But the brilliance of the operation was that Israeli forces decided not only to destroy the Egyptian aircrafts, but to destroy the ground on the airfields, because the Egyptian planes, they couldn't take off if the surface of the airfield wasn't flat, which is why Israelis used a specific type of bomb that would penetrate the earth and in some cases explode later. And when Nasser gave the order to fill the holes with cement, well, what began to happen is that as the workers would approach the holes, some bombs would explode later and kill the workers, which is why Egyptians became scared of approaching the holes and filling them with cement, which is how the Israelis managed to managed to prevent the Egyptians in fixing their own airfields. And also the brilliance of the attack was the second wave of attack. So Egyptians, since they were expecting the Israeli attack, they didn't know it was going to happen that morning, but since they were expecting it generally, they made a bunch of fake planes and put it on the airfield in order for Israel to waste their rockets and bombs on fake airplanes. But in their second wave of attack, Israel decided to use their new weapon they had just bought from the French, the heat-guided missiles. And just as the Egyptian soldiers were beginning to react and enter their planes in order to engage the Israelis in combat, the second wave of attack happened, and Israelis began to fire their heat-guided missiles and destroy only the planes that were actually real planes, since fake planes produced no heat. That was the brilliance of the second wave of attack, to use heat-guided missiles, because the Israelis actually knew that there were going to be fake planes on the ground. And after destroying 80% of the Egyptian Air Force in one day, the morale of the Egyptian soldiers was so low that their marshal decided to retreat from the battlefield, although they actually weren't doing that bad on the ground. And as they were retreating, the Israelis managed to ambush them and massacre 10,000 Egyptian soldiers in one day. And after the largest country of the Arab coalition was defeated, Syria and Jordan also asked for peace. And now some historians claim that Syria and Jordan were actually doing pretty good, and that they could have continued, but they asked for peace because their political leadership was frightened by the early success that Israelis had against the Egyptians. And what happened after this war is a decision that is still relevant today. In their euphoria and in their triumph of quick victory, Israelis, they got too arrogant, and they felt like the Arabs could simply do nothing against them if they were able to win in a war so quickly, which is why they decided to start to build illegal settlements on the West Bank. In that year, the Israeli official policy became to build illegal settlements on the West Bank because the territory came under their control after the Six-Day War, and unfortunately the consequences of that decision are still felt today. If you watched the recent news, these attacks that are happening right now are in a way a direct consequence of that decision that was done in 1967. But okay, let us move on to our next crazy tactic. Do you remember that time when Stalin used a flying aircraft carrier in order to destroy the Romanian oil fields? Well, if you're a normal person, you'll probably answer with no. Okay, so let me explain what the hell happened. In the 1920s, a crazy Soviet engineer, Vladimir Sergeyevich Vachamistrov, had an idea of creating a flying aircraft carrier. Here is how it looked in real life. And at the time, all great powers were faced with an obstacle. Bombers could fly much further than the jet fighters, which meant that on enemy territory they could not utilize their own jet fighters in order to protect their bombers from the enemy jet fighters. And this crazy Soviet engineer had a solution. Let us build a flying aircraft carrier, he said, the Zveno project. It became known as the Zveno project, and in 1931 this crazy vessel for the first time had a successful flight. But if you thought that this idea was something so crazy that it was only done by the communists, well, you are wrong. The first country that built a flying aircraft carrier was actually the British military in World War I, and then the Americans also produced one of their own but the only country that utilized it in a successful way and that used it in combat was Stalin's Soviet Russia. So, okay, what happened? Well, in 1941, the Soviets are attacked by the Germans, and the main source of German oil are the Romanian oil fields. And Stalin decides that it is a priority for the Red Army to destroy the Romanian oil fields. And the Soviets, they bring out their old weapon, and they decided to go with out-of-the-box approach and use this crazy flying aircraft carrier in order to destroy Romanian oil. And a crazy thing that happened is that at the time the Germans knew that Soviet jet fighters were unable to fly as far as to reach Romanian oil fields, which is why when these flying aircraft carriers entered Romanian territory and these jet fighters were then disengaged and sent on their mission, they managed to destroy the Romanian oil fields without the Germans firing a single bullet at them. And why is that? Because they just assumed that those were the German jet fighters, because by using logic they just concluded, well, the Soviets have no technology that would allow their jet fighters to fly above Romania. But they were wrong, because Vladimir Sergeyevich Vakhmistrov actually produced a flying aircraft carrier, and in 1941 the very same vessel was also used in order to successfully destroy a bridge over the Dnieper river, which also crippled the German war machine. And in 1942, as far as we know, the project was finished and the Soviets stopped using them. Now, we actually don't exactly know why. Some claim that after they lost their initial shock value, they were no longer so useful. Some claim that they were too expensive, that Soviets then had other priorities. Others claim that innovations in aerial technology made them unnecessary, with the Americans inventing the Flying Fortress. That was a bomber that had a machine gun on its back and could defend itself from enemy jet fighters. So advancements in aerial technology made these bizarre vessels not as useful as they used to be. But still, what is fascinating to me is that they were quite successfully used in battle by the Soviets. And okay, now let us finish with two battles in Yugoslavia, Battle of Neretva and Battle of Sutjeska. In 1941, the Yugoslav communists found themselves surrounded by 120,000 fascist forces, and we are talking about 40,000 communists that are under siege by 100,000 fascists. On the one side of the Neretva river are the Germans and the Croatian communists. On the other side are the Serbian fascists, the Chetniks, waiting for them. And initially the communists panic and they destroy the bridge on the Neretva river because they wanted to prevent the Serbian fascists from attacking them. And now Tito does something very cunning. He asks the Germans to exchange prisoners. And at that point the communists had captured quite a lot of German officers, and the Germans agreed. And while they're exchanging prisoners, the communists actually decide to rebuild the bridge on the Neretva river during the night, and in the morning they attack the Chetniks. And what was brilliant about this tactic is that at that point the Chetniks were 100% sure that the communists wouldn't attack them, because they had just destroyed the bridge, after all, a day earlier. So they were sure that if they attack them, that it's not going to be at exactly the same point at which they destroyed a bridge. But the attack happened exactly at that point, and in a cult Yugoslav movie, Yul Brynner is actually playing a guy that destroyed the bridge, a communist guy that destroyed the bridge. But after the battle, the fight for survival wasn't over for the communists. The Germans continued to follow them, but at least now the communists were able to go to the mountainous region of Bosnia after breaking through the blockade on the Neretva river. And in the mountainous regions of Zelangora, the Germans were unable to utilize their tanks because the terrain was simply too mountainous for the German tanks, and Tito orders to break through the Zelangora mountain, and the communists manage to break through the German lines, and Tito's dog even dies in this famous battle. His dog is killed by a German bomb, and the same bomb actually killed a British sergeant, Bill Stewart, that was helping Tito at the time. But another British sergeant, Will Dawkin, actually survived, and he was so fascinated by the communist heroism in this battle that he later spoke with Churchill and managed to convince Churchill to provide the communists with their own air force even, and to start helping them by sending them guns. And also a crazy detail from the Battle of Sutjeska is that communist radio by pure accident got destroyed by the Germans, and the main way in which the Germans were able to follow the communists all across Bosnia is by listening to their radio. But now, since they destroyed the radio, they could no longer follow Tito and his Central Committee, which is how Tito survived. And luckily for people of Yugoslavia, Tito survived, and Yugoslavia did not become just another Soviet satellite, because Tito now had the reputation and the cult status necessary in order for him to reject Stalin and start a non-aligned form of communism in Europe. And here you can see a monument built to the Battle of Sutjeska. And by the way, the Yugoslav communists were the only ones that allowed abstract art to be built in their country, which is why Yugoslav communists actually have abstract art glorifying communism, which is quite cool. But okay, that's all for this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you like this video, and see you in the next one.